There is a moment in history so radical, so genuinely dangerous to the established order, that the people in power spent 3 centuries disguising it as a children's story. They gave it treasure maps, they gave it parrots, they gave it swashbuckling heroes and Hollywood smiles, and the disguise worked perfectly. It still does. What they buried underneath that mythology was this. For 6 years, on a small island in the Bahamas that the British Empire had essentially forgotten, approximately 1,000 men and women built a functioning republic. A democracy. A radical experiment in self-governance that operated on principles the great thinkers of Europe would not formally articulate for another 60 years. They had no king. They had no parliament. They had no standing army and no divine mandate. What they had were articles, written, signed contracts that gave every crew member an equal vote, an equal share, an equal standing before whatever justice their community could dispense. They called it Nassau. Historians call it the Pirate Republic. The empires of the world called it an abomination that had to be destroyed before the idea could spread. Today, we strip away the romance, the treasure maps, and the Hollywood mythology. What we find underneath is stranger and more significant than the legend. This is the birth of anarchy. This is how the Pirate Republic of Nassau was built, and why the most powerful governments on earth felt they had no choice but to burn it down. To understand Nassau, you have to understand what the world looked like to the men who built it. Not the world of kings and treaties. The world at sea level. The world experienced by the people at the absolute bottom of the most brutal hierarchies the Atlantic had yet produced. The War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1713. For 12 years it had consumed Europe, and it had consumed the Caribbean for the same 12 years in a parallel conflict fought at sea, a war of commerce and plunder where English privateers operated under royal letters of marque. These were legal documents, official licenses to commit violence on behalf of the crown. These men were not pirates technically. They were contractors, sanctioned violence, paid in a share of whatever they seized. A privateer attacking a Spanish merchant vessel in 1712 was not a criminal. He was an employee of the British Empire. Then the war ended. The Treaty of Utrecht was signed in April 1713, and somewhere between the diplomatic tables in Europe and the actual sea lanes of the Atlantic, 30,000 privateer sailors found themselves simultaneously unemployed and simultaneously illegal. The men who had been attacking Spanish ships with royal approval last year were criminals this year if they continued doing exactly what they had been trained, equipped, and encouraged to do. The British Navy demobilized. Pay stopped. Letters of marque expired. The ships were still out there, still crewed by men who had spent a decade learning that violence at sea was profitable. Men who now found that the only difference between privateer and pirate was a piece of paper that someone in London had decided to stop printing. Think about what that actually means. You have trained soldiers of the sea, men who know every trade route in the Atlantic, men who can navigate by stars, who can read weather 3 days out, who can manage 100 armed sailors in combat, men who are, in every meaningful sense, the most capable maritime warriors in the world. And you have just told them your skills are now a crime. Find honest work. Good luck. The British Empire offered these men 2 choices. They could starve in the gutters of London or Bristol. Veterans discarded the moment their usefulness expired. Or they could take what they needed from the sea. They chose the sea, and they needed a base, a harbor, somewhere outside the reach of the law and outside the law's interest. They needed a place the empire had forgotten. They found exactly that, a small island in the Bahamas, a flyspeck on imperial maps, a place called New Providence. And its main settlement was called Nassau. New Providence had been devastated. Spanish and French raids in 1703 and again in 1706 had reduced the English colonial settlement to rubble. The fort was mostly ruins. The colonial government had effectively collapsed. There was no governor, no garrison, no law enforcement of any kind. But the harbor was extraordinary. One of the finest natural anchorages in the entire Caribbean, deep enough for large captured vessels, shallow enough at the approaches that warships of the line, the heavy, deep-hulled frigates of the Royal Navy, could not pursue you inside. Nature had built a fortress around Nassau. All the pirates had to do was move in. The men who arrived in Nassau in 1713 and 1714 were not arriving with a political philosophy. They were arriving with a problem. They needed to eat. They needed to repair their ships. They needed somewhere to offload captured cargo, somewhere to recruit new crew members, somewhere to sleep that wasn't the open ocean. Nassau solved all of those problems simultaneously. But something happened in Nassau beyond simple refuge, something the historical record captures in fragments and that you have to read carefully to see. The men who came to Nassau started making decisions together. Pirate ships in this period operated under articles, written agreements, contracts signed by every crew member before a voyage, specifying how decisions would be made, how disputes would be resolved, how captured cargo would be divided, and what punishments applied to violations. These were not informal customs. They were legal documents, detailed, specific, and remarkable in one particular aspect. They were democratic. The captain of a Nassau pirate ship was elected. He could be removed by majority vote. His authority during combat was absolute. In battle, a ship needs one voice, one command, one direction, but outside combat, he was essentially first among equals. The quartermaster, also elected separately, served as a formal check on the captain's power, controlling distribution of goods and managing disputes. Major decisions, whether to attack a particular target, whether to accept proposed terms of division, whether to change course or seek a different hunting ground, were put to a vote of the full crew. This was not how any legitimate institution in 1715 operated. The British Navy ran on absolute hierarchy and brutal discipline. Flogging was routine. Pressing men into service against their will was legal. Merchant ships gave captains unchecked authority over crews who had no recourse and no rights. The political systems of England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, all of them were organized around one foundational principle: authority descends from above. From God to king, from king to aristocrat, from aristocrat to merchant, from merchant to everyone else. In Nassau, authority ascended from below. The articles did not come down from a throne. They came up from the crew. Every man signed. Every man voted. Every man had a share. This was the pirate republic. Not an accident. Not chaos. A system. Brutal and democratic in equal measure, operating on principles that the great Enlightenment thinkers of Europe would have recognized immediately if they'd been willing to look. Benjamin Hornigold was one of the founding figures of what historians would eventually call the Flying Gang, the loose confederation of captains who made Nassau their base from roughly 1713 onward. Hornigold was English, a former privateer. By all accounts, a genuinely talented sailor, a capable commander, and in the early Nassau years, something of an idealist, in the specific and limited way that idealism expresses itself in men who have survived hard conditions. Hornigold operated under a peculiar self-imposed restriction in those early years. He refused to attack English ships. French ships, Spanish ships, Dutch ships, these were acceptable targets. English ships were not. This wasn't law. Nassau had no law. It was a principle, held and enforced collectively, that carried with it the vestigial loyalty of men who had served the English crown and hadn't quite finished grieving the end of that relationship. Hornigold at the helm of his vessel, looking at a British merchant ship. His crew gestures toward it eagerly. He shakes his head slowly. The ship passes unmolested. His crew watches it go with mixed expressions: respect, frustration, loyalty. That principle would not survive, because Nassau attracted men from everywhere. English sailors, certainly, but also French, Dutch, Portuguese. men who had served in navies and merchant fleets across the Atlantic world, men who had been enslaved and escaped, men who had been transported to the colonies as indentured labor, completed their terms, and found themselves free but penniless in a world that had no use for them, and men who had been born free in the Caribbean, in communities the colonial powers acknowledged only when they wanted something from them. These men did not share Hornigold's English loyalties, and in the democracy of Nassau, their votes counted equally. Hornigold's principle lasted as long as it could command a majority. Then it did not. Thomas Barrow arrived in Nassau in the early years and declared himself, with the particular confidence of a man who had nothing to lose, governor of New Providence. His proclamation was essentially, "This island is a retreat for pirates. Come here. You're safe here. Bring what you've taken and sell it here." Barrow lacked the organizational genius of Hornigold and the theatrical brilliance of the men who would come after him. But he understood something essential. Nassau needed to be declared. It needed to name itself, even if no empire would recognize the name. He did that. He made Nassau real by insisting it was real. The Flying Gang, a navy without a state. The Flying Gang grew through 1714, 1715, 1716. Nassau's population expanded and consolidated, absorbing arriving crews, integrating new ships, becoming something more organized and more formidable than a simple haven for outcasts. At its peak, Nassau's pirate community could put somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 armed men on ships simultaneously. No single colonial governor in the Caribbean commanded that much force. The combined British naval presence in the region during the years when London was focused on European affairs and had not yet recognized the scale of what was developing in the Bahamas. It was barely larger than what Nassau could deploy. Nassau was, for a window of approximately 5 years, a genuine naval power. Not a gang, not a mob, a power. The operations launched from Nassau in this period were not the random opportunism of desperate men. They were coordinated, systematic, and increasingly sophisticated. Ships worked in concert. Information about convoy routes and cargo manifests circulated through the Nassau community. Captains who had competed as privateers now collaborated as something closer to a navy, without a state, identifying targets collectively, attacking in coordinated waves, dividing proceeds according to articles they had collectively agreed. In 1716 alone, Nassau-based pirates captured goods worth an estimated several £100,000 sterling. Sugar, tobacco, manufactured goods, silver from Spanish shipments. The commerce of the Atlantic was bleeding. The empires were beginning to notice. Edward Teach arrived in Nassau sometime around 1716. He came under the wing of Benjamin Hornigold, who recognized talent the way good commanders always do, immediately and without hesitation. Hornigold gave him command of a captured sloop. Within a year, Teach had accumulated a small fleet and a reputation that had already begun to outrun the actual evidence of his crimes. He was operating as Blackbeard by 1717, and the mythology was already overtaking the man. What is less understood about Blackbeard, what the treasure map version of the story buries completely, is the degree to which he was a product of Nassau's specific political culture rather than simply a violent personality who happened to end up there. The theatrical ferocity, the burning fuses in the hair, the elaborate performance of menace. These weren't the expressions of a sadist. They were calculated tools of a man who had thought carefully about the economics of violence. Blackbeard, by the historical record, killed remarkably few people. He captured dozens of ships with minimal bloodshed because his reputation preceded him so effectively that most merchant captains concluded resistance was irrational before he'd fired a shot. Terror, credibly deployed, eliminated the need for actual violence. He was, in a specific sense, a pirate intellectual. A man who had optimized his operation around the insight that the best violence is the violence you never have to commit. He operated with a degree of coordination with Nassau's broader community that makes pirate an inadequate description. He corresponded with other captains. He participated in Nassau's informal governance structures. He was, for a period, part of something larger than himself. Charles Vane, the true believer. Where Hornigold retained his English loyalty and Blackbeard maintained a pragmatic flexibility about almost everything, Charles Vane was something closer to a genuine idealist, a true believer in Nassau as an institution, as a project, as something worth defending even at the cost of everything else. Vane was one of the most aggressive of the Nassau captains, but his aggression was not random. It was principled, in the specific and uncomfortable way that principle expresses itself in men who have nothing left to lose. When the British eventually sent a governor with an offer of pardon, Vane was among the most vociferous opponents of acceptance. Not because he feared the hangman, though he should have, but because he understood that accepting the pardon meant accepting the legitimacy of the power that was offering it, and that this single concession would unravel everything Nassau had built. You could not take the king's mercy and remain a republic. You could not accept the crown's forgiveness and maintain that the crown had no authority over you. The logic was clear. The moment you took the pardon, you admitted the pardon was the king's to give. He was right, and he lost the argument anyway. Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The articles had no gender clause. Anne Bonny and Mary Read arrive in the Nassau story during this same period, and their presence in the historical record is worth dwelling on, because it complicates the already complicated picture of who Nassau actually was. Bonny left her husband for John Rackham, known as Calico Jack, and joined his crew as a full member. Read arrived aboard ship disguised as a man, was discovered to be a woman, and remained with the crew on exactly equal terms. Both women fought alongside male crew members. Both were described in contemporary accounts as more ferocious in combat than most of the men aboard. The fact that women could occupy this role in Nassau's world, fighting, voting, earning shares, existing as functional equals in a context where their entire social world had defined them as property, is not an accident. It is a direct consequence of Nassau's foundational principle. You signed the articles. You got a vote. The articles, so far as we know, did not specify gender. Neither Bonny nor Read was exceptional within Nassau's community. They were expressions of it. The democracy of Nassau was imperfect and often brutal, but it was, by the standards of 1716, shockingly inclusive. And it was inclusive not out of ideology but out of practical logic. If you could fight and work and hold your articles, you counted. That was all. Before we go further, we are now at the heart of the story and things are about to get darker. If you've made it this far, you're clearly the kind of person who wants the real history, not the sanitized version. Subscribe to Rogue Bilge and hit the bell. We go deep on the stories that the official history prefers to leave buried, the golden age of piracy, the forgotten wars, the people at the bottom of every hierarchy who found ways to fight back. And I want your opinion on something. Drop it in the comments right now. If you were in Nassau in 1716, which captain do you sail under? Hornigold, the pragmatist who built it; Blackbeard, the intellectual who terrified it; Vane, the true believer who died for it? Or do you take your own ship and sign your own articles? Let me know. Now back to Nassau because the empire is about to arrive. The economics of Nassau are almost never discussed in the accounts that prefer to focus on cannon fire and treasure chests. But the economics are where the radicalism lives. Nassau ran on a redistributive economy. Captured cargo came in and was divided according to the articles. Captains received 2 shares to a common sailor's 1. The quartermaster received a share and a half. Specialists, the carpenter and the surgeon, whose skills kept ships operational and crews alive, received additional compensation above the standard share. And men injured in combat received payment from a common fund before the general division. A set amount for a lost arm, a set amount for a lost leg, a set amount for an eye. It was recognizably a form of workers' compensation, operating in a community that had no government to mandate it. They had built it themselves from first principles, because they understood that a crew that feared being discarded when injured would not fight well. Compare this to legitimate maritime employment of the same period. Merchant sailors were paid at the captain's discretion. They received nothing for injuries. They had no legal recourse when wages were withheld, which happened routinely. Naval sailors were subject to flogging, could be pressed into service against their will, and had essentially no rights that any officer was legally obligated to respect. The men who came to Nassau were not abandoning reasonable employment for a life of crime. They were abandoning legalized exploitation for something closer to fair terms, at the cost of being hunted by every navy in the Atlantic. That is the actual Nassau bargain, and it explains the numbers. 1,000 men do not choose a life where capture means hanging unless the alternative is a life where survival means something they have already decided is worse. The question of slavery. The moral complexity of Nassau is nowhere more visible than in the question of slavery. The Pirate Republic was not an abolitionist movement. It did not arrive at a principled rejection of slavery as an institution. What it arrived at in practice was something messier and more interesting. Black sailors served in Nassau crews in numbers completely unlike anything in legitimate maritime employment of the period. Freed slaves served as full members with full voting rights and full shares of captured cargo on many Nassau ships. Escaped slaves arrived in Nassau and were integrated into the community without being returned to their owners, not out of ideology, but out of the same practical logic that governed everything else. You were useful, you signed the articles, you got a vote and a share. That was Nassau's test, and it applied to everyone who passed through the harbor. But some Nassau captains also transported captured enslaved people as cargo. Some sold them. The Republic held both realities simultaneously, never resolved the tension between them, and the tension is important. Nassau demonstrated that integration was possible, that a functional society could exist without racial hierarchy. And it demonstrated it incompletely, partially, in the messy and compromised way that radical experiments in human equality almost always demonstrate such things in practice. The Board of Trade reports from this period show an escalating alarm about Nassau that goes far beyond simple concern about stolen cargo. The language of the reports is interesting because it keeps reaching for the right word and not quite finding it. Nassau is described as a nest of pirates, which is accurate but insufficient, a threat to commerce, true but understated, a dangerous example, and that, finally, is closer to the actual concern. The dangerous example problem was this. Nassau demonstrated that a community of poor people could organize themselves without a king, sustain themselves through collective action, and successfully resist the most powerful naval forces in the world for years. This was information that the ruling class of Europe did not want widely distributed. Not because they believed the pirates were philosophers, not because Nassau had a manifesto or a theory of itself, but because they could see, in the economic disruption Nassau was causing and the manpower it was attracting from legitimate employment, the outlines of a contagion. If poor men at sea could build a functional republic without a king, what did that suggest to poor men on land? What did it suggest to the conscripted soldiers, the indentured servants, the pressed sailors, the enslaved populations of the colonial world? Nassau had to be ended, not merely suppressed, ended, and ended so thoroughly that the memory of it could be transformed into adventure rather than politics, into romance rather than revolution, into the golden age of piracy rather than the most significant experiment in democratic self-governance the Atlantic world had yet seen. The Act of Grace, divide and conquer. King George I issued the Act of Grace in September 1717. Full pardon to any pirate who surrendered by the deadline. It was a calculated political move, designed to fracture the Nassau community, to offer its members an individual exit ramp, separating those who could be reintegrated into legitimate society from those who would refuse, and who could therefore be hunted down without the political complication of having to pardon everyone around them. The offer was brilliant because it weaponized the one thing the Republic had never solved: the absence of a shared political language strong enough to articulate, collectively, what they were defending. Nassau had practices. It had articles, customs, a functional culture of rough equality, but it had no theory of itself, no framework for explaining to its own members why the individual safety being offered was less valuable than the collective project being dissolved. The French and American revolutions, which would articulate exactly that kind of political language 60 years later, owed nothing directly to Nassau. The intellectual genealogy doesn't connect cleanly. But the problem Nassau failed to solve: how do you sustain collective self-governance against the organized violence of existing power, was exactly the problem the revolutionaries of the late 18th century were trying to solve. They had philosophy departments and printing presses and decades of accumulated political theory. Nassau had articles and a good harbor. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor in July 1718. He brought a Royal Navy escort, the authority of a governor's commission, and a very clear mandate from London: end the Republic. What Rogers found when he arrived was something unexpected. The harbor was defended. Charles Vane's fleet was there, armed and ready. The Nassau community had held a debate, a collective political process, about whether to resist or surrender. Some had voted for acceptance of the pardon. Some had voted for resistance. The debate had been real. The vote had been real. That debate, the fact that a community of outlaws organized a political process to decide whether to fight or surrender to a naval governor backed by the British Crown, is the most Nassau thing that Nassau ever did. They voted. They disagreed. The Republic held its last democratic proceeding. And then, as democracies sometimes do, it chose the path that ended it. Narrator: Vane fired a cannon at Rogers' fleet as he sailed out of Nassau Harbor. It was not a tactical gesture. It was a statement. He was not accepting, not submitting, not acknowledging. He was leaving on his own terms, or trying to. The fates. Benjamin Hornigold accepted the pardon and became, in one of history's more dramatic reversals, a pirate hunter working for the Crown. His knowledge of Nassau's operations, its networks, its captains, and their habits made him devastatingly effective in this new role. He died in a shipwreck in 1719, before the full implications of his choice had time to fully unfold. The sea, at least, did not hold a moral position. Charles Vane refused the pardon, fled Nassau, and spent the next 2 years as a hunted man. He was captured in 1720, tried in Jamaica, and hanged. He had been right about what the pardon meant. He died for being right. John Rackham, Calico Jack, accepted the pardon briefly, then returned to piracy, was captured in 1720, and hanged in Jamaica. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were captured with him. Read died in prison before her sentence could be carried out. Bonny's fate after her trial is genuinely unknown. The record simply stops. She disappears from history as cleanly as she had entered it. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, was dead by November 1718, killed in a deliberate, specifically ordered confrontation with Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy off the coast of North Carolina. The account of his death reads like something his own mythology generated: 5 musket balls and 20 sword wounds before he went down. The British government considered him not merely a criminal, but a symbol that had to be destroyed before it could be martyred. They destroyed it efficiently. Narrator: by 1720, Nassau was over. The harbor was under British administration. The captains were dead or converted. The articles were dissolved. The democracy of Nassau, which had operated continuously for approximately 6 years and had functioned as the most radical experiment in collective self-governance the Atlantic world had yet seen, was dismantled so efficiently that most of the people living through it probably did not fully understand what had been lost. What had been lost was a proof of concept. The men and women of Nassau had demonstrated, empirically, that you did not need a king to organize collective action. That hierarchy was not the only available architecture for human cooperation. That people at the absolute bottom of every legitimate social structure could build something functional and durable, and for a period militarily formidable, without the permission of anyone above them. The Republic lasted 6 years. It attracted the poor, the dispossessed, the formerly enslaved, the formerly press-ganged, the formerly indentured people who had every reason to believe the existing world had nothing for them. And it gave them a vote, a share, and a community that operated on the principle that they mattered. The forgetting was not accidental. The story of Nassau was transformed into adventure story, into romance, into the golden age of piracy. And in that transformation, it was drained of exactly the meaning that had made it dangerous when it was real. The treasure maps and the swashbuckling heroes and the Hollywood mythology serve a purpose. They prevent you from asking the question the Nassau community implicitly asked every day of its existence. The question is, who decided this was the only way to arrange the world? Who decided that authority must descend from above? Who decided that the men who do the labor must accept the terms offered by the men who own the ships? Who decided, and why should the decision stand? Nassau asked that question with cannons and articles and a very good harbor. The empire answered it with warships and hangings, and 300 years of turning the question into a children's story. The harbor is still there. The shallow approaches are still shallow. If you read the accounts, if you sit with the articles and the depositions and the Board of Trade reports and the trial transcripts, something comes through that the official history has always worked very hard to keep submerged. The men and women of Nassau were not simply criminals. They were people who looked at the world as it was arranged and decided to arrange it differently. And they succeeded at that project long enough to matter, long enough to frighten the most powerful governments on earth, long enough that those governments felt they had no choice but to send a warship to end it. That's not a pirate story. That's a political story. It just wore a pirate story as a disguise, and the disguise worked perfectly. It still does. The Republic lasted 6 years. The forgetting has lasted 300. Thanks for watching Rogue Bilge. If this is your first time here, welcome to the crew. If you've been here before, you know what we do. The real history, the stories that matter, the people the official record tried to bury. Subscribe. Share this video with someone who thinks they know the pirate story. Show them what they're actually looking at. Drop a comment. I want to know, does Nassau change how you think about democracy, about who gets to build a society, about what we call crime and what we call order and who decides the difference? Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and remember what Nassau proved, even if it took 300 years for anyone to say it plainly. Narrator, you don't need a king.